It was the third Sunday of Lent, and Saint. Botolph's rang with the last bright chord of "Come down, O love divine," when the scandal was noticed. Not announced, not screamed, but observed. Mildred Instow's seat on the choir bench, second from the left in the soprano row, was empty. That in itself was not the scandal. Even the most devout choir mistress is permitted illness or crisis. But what turned necks and tightened murmurs into tension was the object left on the bench in her place. A hymnal, opened not to that morning's sequence, but to hymn 303, Abide with Me, its pages neatly folded into a triangle, as though prepared to fly. Atop it sat a single pink rose, already beginning to brown at the edges. The service concluded awkwardly. The final prayer read with 2 hesitations and 1 mispronunciation. As pews creaked and hats were readjusted, the gossip began to take root, already flowering before the church doors swung open. "She's never missed a Sunday in 12 years, not even when her nephew broke his leg. I heard she resigned. Too much pressure from the altos. Not pressure, grief. Something's wrong." That rose was a sign. I read about it in a novel. My cousin's neighbor saw her bicycle by the duck pond at dawn, just left there, saddle askew. She's gone to confront the vicar. There's been tension about the new hymn board numbering, hasn't there? More likely someone confronted her. Mildred could make enemies just tuning a pitch pipe Inspector Purbright, who had chosen to attend the service not for spiritual nourishment, but because Sergeant Love had once described Saint Botolph's as a local epicenter of Sunday subterfuge, remained seated in the last pew. He had watched the whole affair unfold with mild interest, but now, as others filtered out in whispered clusters, he rose and stepped towards the choir stall. The rose was indeed fresh, but not newly cut. Its stem bore a faint smudge of pale foundation, the type transferred from a careful cheek or powdered glove. The hymnal's folded triangle pointed not upwards, but down, its edge grazing the carved foot of the bench where the varnish had been recently scratched. Love appeared at his elbow, blinking with the effort of trying to appear inconspicuous. "She's never missed a Sunday?" he asked. "Not voluntarily," Purbright murmured. "Even God, I suspect, is wondering what kept her. Should we speak to the vicar?" "In time." "But first," he said, lifting the hymnal slightly to reveal a scrap of paper tucked beneath the rose. "Let's see if Miss Instow left her own sermon." The scrap was small, torn unevenly from stationery, with 5 words neatly inked in her unmistakably upright hand. "Do not let them hush." Love read it, brow furrowing. Odd turn of phrase. "You think it's a threat?" "Or a plea," said Purbright. Either way, it was left to be found. As they stepped out into the pale afternoon, the vicar, Reverend Smollett, was fielding concerned inquiries with the benign confusion of a man surprised by his own sermon's unintended consequences. "I'm sure Miss Instow is simply unwell," he was saying. "No need to speculate." "Then why the rose?" someone asked. "And the note," another chimed in. Purbright and Love moved past them quietly, making their way down the gravel path toward the lich gate, where the notice board displayed this week's verse, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and an outdated poster for the church's pancake supper. Something else caught Purbright's eye. At the bottom corner of the board, beneath a curled notice about choir auditions, someone had tacked a small envelope, unmarked, unsealed, and resting crookedly as if hurriedly placed. He plucked it loose and opened it. Inside was a photograph, grainy, black and white. It depicted a row of choir benches, those very ones inside the nave. But in the photo, every bench was empty except one. Miss Instow sat alone, eyes turned not to a hymnal, but directly toward the camera. Behind her, through the leaded window, was a shape, faint, ambiguous, human, possibly, shadowed. Love leaned in. "That's not from today." "No," Purbright said. "But someone wanted us to see her absence before it became real." As they crossed the road toward the green, a small terrier barked twice from inside a bicycle basket outside the bakery. The bicycle, upright but loosely chained, was unmistakably Miss Instow's. A light smear of pink pollen clung to the handlebar tape. Its front tire was slightly deflated, the saddle, indeed, askew. Purbright stood beside it for a moment, letting the details arrange themselves into possible meanings. "Is it odd," Love said, "that the one person we can't ask questions of is the only one who seemed to have all the answers?" "Not odd," Purbright said, "just inconvenient." From the bakery window, Mrs. Norbury peered out, flower on her sleeves, then vanished as quickly as she appeared. Before Love could comment further, Purbright held up the envelope and turned it over. There, faintly embossed on the back flap, was the logo of the Flaxborough Amateur Photography Society, 3 shuttered irises in a clover pattern. "Well," said Purbright, "it seems our mystery may develop in a dark room." Flaxborough's Amateur Photography Society had not for some years produced anything particularly amateur or photographic. It now met once a fortnight in the community hall's side annex, which had once been a changing room for a short-lived badminton league and still bore the ghost of liniment beneath the scent of fresh laminate. When Purbright and Love arrived, the Monday evening meeting was already underway, and a slide projector was casting sepia-tinted aspic molds onto a curling bedsheet nailed to the far wall. "Composition in condiments," whispered Love, leaning in. "That's last year's theme. This is the runner-up, chutney 3 ways." Purbright's nod was barely perceptible. He had already spotted Mr. Arnold Slattery near the biscuit table, loading a 3rd custard cream onto his saucer with the practiced guilt of a man who thought he deserved better from life and planned to exact justice via bourbons. Slattery, secretary of the society for 15 years and its most reluctant exhibitor, was one of those men who took photographs with the quiet bitterness of someone who believed the world owed him more photogenic subjects. "Ah," he said as the 2 men approached. "Inspector, Sergeant, I wondered when you might come calling." "We're hoping you can identify the origin of this," said Purbright, handing over the photograph of Mildred Instow on the choir bench. Slattery studied it without alarm. "One of ours, certainly. The embossings from our last exhibition batch took them for the Faces of Faith series, mostly portraits of choirs, bell ringers, that sort of thing." "Do you remember who submitted this one?" asked Love. Slattery hesitated, frowning. "That would be Gerald Claff. Always had a soft focus for the sacred. Odd duck. Ex-postmaster, bought himself a second-hand Leica and now thinks he's Walker Evans." "Where might we find Mr. Claff?" Slattery sipped his tea. "Flat above the stationery shop. Lives alone, unless you count the canaries." The flat above the shop was a narrow affair, smelling faintly of seed mix and something more elusive, fixative perhaps, or mothballs infused with resentment. Mr. Gerald Claff answered the door in a waistcoat and fingerless gloves, eyes magnified by bifocals. "Miss Instow," he said at once. I didn't think anyone else had noticed the absence. You took this photograph? Purbright asked, offering it to him. Yes, I sent it in for the exhibit. She never knew I'd captured it. Didn't pose, just sat like that between rehearsals. I found it. Striking. Do you remember the day you took it? 2 weeks ago, late afternoon, overcast. She just had words with the organist, I think. Something about transposing Handel to accommodate the new tenors. She looked quite resolved. Do you often photograph the choir? No, just her. He seemed unembarrassed. She had a presence, like a stern lighthouse. You don't forget that kind of silhouette. Purbright let that settle before asking, Did you share this photo with anyone else? No, except the society, of course. They handled the printing, but I didn't include it in my final submission. Too private. But someone found it, Love pointed out. Claff nodded, slow and pained. Then someone's been rifling the archives. As they left the flat, a thought tugged at Purbright's mind. Not the content of the photo, but the positioning. Miss Instow had been framed alone, yet the benches behind her, blurred but visible, had bore distinct shadows, slight curved indentations, as if someone had stood, unseen, at the ready. Do you think she was being watched? Love asked. Possibly, Purbright said. Or perhaps she knew she was being watched and chose her place accordingly. By the next morning, the photo had somehow made its way onto the church notice board. Pinned beside a quote from Corinthians and the flower rota, it was accompanied by a typed slip of paper. She was the voice. Now hear the silence. The town had not expected a sequel. Whispers escalated into muttered theories by elevenses. Some believed she had eloped. Others suspected a nervous breakdown brought on by bell tower acoustics. One woman was overheard suggesting that Mildred Instow had finally joined a convent with stricter musical discipline. Reverend Smollett had, by this point, convened an emergency vestry meeting, which accomplished little beyond the proposal to repaint the church fence as a gesture of renewal. Back at the station, Purbright examined the typeface of the newest note. It matched the one from the hymnal. Same slightly misaligned S, same faint overstrike on the E. A battered machine, used often and without care. Not Claff's work. His apartment had been obsessively neat, and his typewriter was in a case with a polishing cloth folded atop it. This one's from a different corner, he said. Another member of the choir, Love offered, or the parish, or someone with access to the vestry and enough interest in hymns to pick one as a message. They returned to the church that afternoon and found the verger, Miss Tickle, arranging lilies on the altar with the reverence of someone attending to royalty with hay fever. Miss Instow hasn't come by, she said at once, nor has she phoned. And she always rings ahead if she's late, even for dusting. Was she close with anyone in the parish? Purbright asked. Tickle snorted faintly. Close? Mildred? Only to the Lord and the tuning fork. No confidants. Well, she paused. She did take tea with Mrs. Dudgeon from time to time, the widow who plays the oboe at Christmas. But they mostly discussed the state of the hymn board, which was, Tickle sighed, in disarray. Numbers misaligned. A rogue thumbtack lodged in 248 for 3 weeks. It was a source of much grief. Purbright glanced toward the board. The numbers displayed today were 128, 164, and 303. Abide with me again. Listed, but not sung. As they stepped out into the evening light, a folded slip of paper was waiting on the stone ledge of the church's entrance. No envelope. just folded once and set carefully in place. Purbright opened it. She knew who altered the notes. That's why she vanished. Love exhaled. What does that mean? Purbright turned back toward the hymn board. Perhaps, he said quietly, someone changed more than the music. The clue was too intentional to be dismissed as coincidence. She knew who altered the notes. It sounded poetic at first glance, but in Flaxborough, where hymns were treated with more sanctity than scripture, it might be dangerously literal. Inspector Purbright spent the early evening combing through the service archives in the church office, with Sergeant Love dutifully cataloguing anomalies. The vestry clerk, a man with a nervous cough and a distrust of paperclips, had been happy to oblige once reassured the records would be returned precisely as filed. "Look here, sir," Love said, pointing to a folder marked Evensong Programs, Lent. 2 weeks ago, the hymn listing included 164, 198, and 303. But the choir actually sang 128, 164, and 246. That's 3 services now with mismatched listings. Consistent alterations? Purbright asked, not looking up. Only the last hymn, always 303 inserted. Purbright's brow furrowed slightly. Abide with me. Love nodded. Odd choice for a Sunday. More of a funeral standard, isn't it? Indeed, said Purbright, unless one is rehearsing a departure. The question now was, who had altered the hymn numbers, and why had it mattered to Miss Instow? She was precise to a fault, and the hymn board was sacred territory. Any deviation would have registered as both an affront and a message. By the time they returned to the police station, dusk had slanted over the rooftops, and the bakery's daily chalkboard had been wiped clean. The square was quiet, save for the clatter of a distant bin lid and the soft, off-key humming of someone closing up the off-license. A small envelope lay on Purbright's desk. No postmark, no address, just his name, in blocky type. Inside, folded with great care, was a page from a choir practice ledger. The date was 2 weeks ago. The notes were meticulous, Miss Instow's hand, but one entry had been underlined twice in red ink. Solo rehearsal cancelled, keys missing from drawer, complaint noted with vicar. What drawer? Love asked. Choir robbing cupboard, Purbright said. Metal, kept locked, contains tuning forks, spare music, metronome and the key to the organ loft. The last being of particular interest, Love frowned. Why would anyone want access to the organ loft? To change something, Purbright said. Perhaps something the choir would later perform, or something someone wouldn't want them to. They returned to St. Botolph's under cover of darkness, keys collected from a reluctant Reverend Smollett, who insisted he would rather not be informed of anything until it could be confirmed as either wholly good or thoroughly over. Inside the church, their footsteps echoed in soft clicks across the flagstones. Purbright directed Love to the robing cupboard behind the side chapel. The lock had been jimmied, not expertly, but with precision. Inside, the expected items were present. Tuning forks, spare scores, a box of dog-eared psalters, but the metronome's winding key was missing, and more notably, so was the small tin marked Organ Spares, Do Not Remove. At the organ loft, they ascended the narrow stairwell. Dust lay thickly over the banister, but near the top step, a single patch had been brushed clean. Recently, someone had passed through, wiping their way or gripping for balance. The loft was shadowed and still. Purbright opened the access panel to the back of the pipes, where the organ's register pins were housed. One was missing. Another had been reinserted, but backwards. "Well," Love said quietly, "you can't play the right music if the keys themselves are lying." Back at the station, the case felt suddenly closer to the surface. A pattern was forming: tampered music, missing keys, altered hymn selections, and Mildred Instow, the only one likely to have noticed, vanishing on the Sunday that the wrong hymn was listed again. The rose, the note, the photograph. They weren't gestures of sentiment. They were warnings, or farewells. By late morning the next day, another message appeared. This time it was tucked into the offertory plate during a weekday communion, discovered by Miss Tickle while counting envelopes. It read, "She heard the dissonance," but others sang along. Reverend Smollett was visibly shaken. "This is not a town for metaphors, Inspector. We prefer our sins straightforward." But Purbright wasn't smiling. He was examining the paper. "Same machine," he said. "Same misaligned S." "That makes 4 notes now," Love added. "And the implication keeps pointing at a group, not just a person." Purbright nodded. "The choir committee meets tonight, does it not?" Smollett sighed. "Yes, they'll be discussing the Easter program, and no doubt Miss Instow's absence." "Then I believe we'd better attend." As the day rolled on, whispers began to return with the regularity of milk vans and deliveries. Word had spread that Inspector Purbright was poking about the choir stalls and that the police had asked questions about hymnals. A few remarked that it was only a matter of time before someone brought up the Jubilee cantata incident, where notes had allegedly gone missing and been reprinted in an illegal key. But all that paled when Mrs. Dudgeon, the oboist, was seen leaving the church office in tears, clutching her music folder and muttering, "She told me not to say anything. But now it's too late, isn't it?" Love watched from across the square. "She's cracked," he said. "You think she knows what happened?" Purbright stared at the robbing cupboard key, still in his hand. "I think she may know who made sure no one else could hear it." The clue was too intentional to be dismissed as coincidence. She knew who altered the notes. It sounded poetic at first glance, but in Flaxborough, where hymns were treated with more sanctity than scripture, it might be dangerously literal. Inspector Purbright spent the early evening combing through the service archives in the church office, with Sergeant Love dutifully cataloguing anomalies. The vestry clerk, a man with a nervous cough and a distrust of paperclips, had been happy to oblige once reassured the records would be returned precisely as filed. "Look here, sir," Love said, pointing to a folder marked Evensong Programs, Lent. 2 weeks ago, the hymn listing included 164, 198, and 303. But the choir actually sang 128, 164, and 246. That's 3 services now with mismatched listings. "Consistent alterations?" Purbright asked, not looking up. "Only the last hymn. Always 303 inserted." Purbright's brow furrowed slightly. "Abide with me." Love nodded. "Odd choice for a Sunday. More of a funeral standard, isn't it?" "Indeed," said Purbright, "unless one is rehearsing a departure." The question now was, who had altered the hymn numbers, and why had it mattered to Miss Instow? She was precise to a fault, and the hymn board was sacred territory. Any deviation would have registered as both an affront and a message. By the time they returned to the police station, dusk had slanted over the rooftops. and the bakery's daily chalkboard had been wiped clean. The square was quiet, save for the clatter of a distant bin lid and the soft, off-key humming of someone closing up the off-license. A small envelope lay on Purbright's desk. No postmark, no address, just his name in blocky type. Inside, folded with great care, was a page from a choir practice ledger. The date was 2 weeks ago. The notes were meticulous, Miss Instow's hand, but one entry had been underlined twice in red ink. Solo rehearsal cancelled, keys missing from drawer, complaint noted with vicar. What drawer? Love asked. Choir robbing cupboard, Purbright said. Metal, kept locked, contains tuning forks, spare music, metronome, and the key to the organ loft. The last being of particular interest, Love frowned. Why would anyone want access to the organ loft? To change something, Purbright said. Perhaps something the choir would later perform, or something someone wouldn't want them to. They returned to St. Botolph's under cover of darkness, keys collected from a reluctant Reverend Smollett, who insisted he would rather not be informed of anything until it could be confirmed as either wholly good or thoroughly over. Inside the church, their footsteps echoed in soft clicks across the flagstones. Purbright directed Love to the robing cupboard behind the side chapel. The lock had been jimmied, not expertly, but with precision. Inside, the expected items were present: tuning forks, spare scores, a box of dog-eared psalters, but the metronome's winding key was missing, and more notably, so was the small tin marked "Organ Spares, Do Not Remove." At the organ loft, they ascended the narrow stairwell. Dust lay thickly over the banister, but near the top step, a single patch had been brushed clean. Recently, someone had passed through, wiping their way, or gripping for balance. The loft was shadowed and still. Purbright opened the access panel to the back of the pipes, where the organ's register pins were housed. One was missing, another had been reinserted, but backwards. Well, Love said quietly, you can't play the right music if the keys themselves are lying. Back at the station, the case felt suddenly closer to the surface. A pattern was forming: tampered music, missing keys, altered hymn selections, and Mildred Instow, the only one likely to have noticed, vanishing on the Sunday that the wrong hymn was listed again. The rose, the note, the photograph. They weren't gestures of sentiment. They were warnings, or farewells. By late morning the next day, another message appeared. This time, it was tucked into the offertory plate during a weekday communion, discovered by Miss Tickle while counting envelopes. It read, "She heard the dissonance, but others sang along." Reverend Smollett was visibly shaken. This is not a town for metaphors, Inspector. We prefer our sins straightforward, but Purbright wasn't smiling. He was examining the paper. Same machine, he said. Same misaligned S. That makes 4 notes now, Love added, and the implication keeps pointing at a group, not just a person. Purbright nodded. The choir committee meets tonight, does it not? Smollett sighed. Yes, they'll be discussing the Easter program, and no doubt Miss Instow's absence. Then I believe we'd better attend. As the day rolled on, whispers began to return with the regularity of milk vans and deliveries. Word had spread that Inspector Purbright was poking about the choir stalls and that the police had asked questions about hymnals. A few remarked that it was only a matter of time before someone brought up the Jubilee cantata incident, where notes had allegedly gone missing and been reprinted in an illegal key. But all that paled when Mrs. Dudgeon, the oboist, was seen leaving the church office in tears, clutching her music folder and muttering, "She told me not to say anything. But now it's too late, isn't it?" Love watched from across the square. "She's cracked," he said. "You think she knows what happened?" Purbright stared at the robbing cupboard key, still in his hand. "I think she may know who made sure no one else could hear it." Morning brought drizzle, steady and undecided, coating the town in a thin sheen of damp that muffled footsteps and blurred windscreen wipers. At the station, Inspector Purbright sat motionless behind his desk, examining the photograph delivered the night before. Miss Priddy on the choir bench where Mildred Instow should have been, captured in the same angle, same lighting, the same fragile quiet. But this version was older, dated 6 months prior, and altered. The inked message scrawled across the background, "She saw before I did," had not been written by Miss Instow's hand. The loops were looser, less disciplined. The S curled inwards, as though apologizing for existing. Sergeant Love stood near the kettle, letting the water boil slightly too long in his distraction. "Why that bench?" he asked. "Why that moment? Why stage a photograph as if time repeated itself, but with the players switched?" "Because someone wanted to remind us of what was lost," Purbright said. "Or who? But that photo, Miss Priddy's in Mildred's place. It's not just a memory. It's a reversal." "Exactly," Purbright said. "Someone wants us to see a change in role, either warning us that Miss Priddy replaced her willingly, or regretted it." Love lowered the kettle. "You think Miss Priddy's involved?" Purbright was quiet for a moment. "I think Miss Priddy knows more than she's prepared to say." Just then, P.C. Willoughby entered with an expression that promised trouble. "Sir, the flower stall woman, Mrs. Drabble. She's come in with something she says was discreetly posted through her garden gate this morning." He held out a sheet of music. Purbright took it gently. It was hand-annotated, marked in pencil, and carried the heading, "Arrangement for Unison Choir, Benediction for Easter Vigil." The key signature was wrong, the tempo uncertain, but most strikingly, the final 3 bars had been circled in red and rewritten above the original line in Mildred Instow's unmistakable hand. "She rewrote the ending," Purbright murmured. "And someone didn't want her to," Love added. In the margin, a single word had been scribbled in block letters. "Stop." The moment hung in the air like a dissonant chord. Back at the church, they asked to see the choir's official Easter Vigil score. Reverend Smollett, now resigned to the pace of ecclesiastical scandal, fetched it from the vestry cabinet and placed it on the table like one might hand over a delicate confession. They turned to the final piece. There it was, the original ending, no corrections, no alternate bars, the same as it had been in previous years. "Then this," Love said, holding up the annotated copy, "was her attempt to change the conclusion." Quietly. "But someone prevented it," Purbright said, "and now they're trying to erase her entirely." He placed the photo of Priddy beside the music sheet. Both were documents of substitution. One replaced a singer, the other replaced the song. "The real question," he said, "is why this ending mattered so much." "Maybe it was symbolic," Love guessed. "You know, like some spiritual message?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, "but music, like truth, is rarely altered without consequence." By mid-afternoon, Mrs. Dudgeon returned, nervous, red-eyed, clutching something wrapped in a scarf. "I didn't know whether to bring this," she said, "but I was afraid not to." She unwrapped a cassette tape. The label had nearly peeled away, but just visible in faded biro was the phrase, "Final Rehearsal, Tuesday." "I borrowed it from the recorder in the loft," she whispered, "just to review the harmonies. I'd forgotten I had it." Purbright turned the tape in his hand. "This is the last session Miss Instow attended." Mrs. Dudgeon nodded. "The day before she disappeared." They played the tape on the old station recorder. The sound crackled at first, static, shuffling, throat clearings, then the warm layering of voices. The choir sang the Easter benediction, the version with the original ending. But as the final bars approached, there was a hesitation, a subtle falter. Then Mildred's voice, distinct and unyielding, "No, that isn't right. We rehearsed the amended close. Page 12, revised cadence." A pause, then a different voice, male, cool, clipped. "Miss Instow, we've agreed to retain the traditional arrangement." "You agreed," she replied. "I submitted the corrected form. If it's been overwritten, I want to know why." Another silence, then the sound of someone rising, a chair scraping, footsteps fading. The recording ended abruptly. Love reached over and stopped the tape. "Well," he said softly, "there's your conflict." Purbright nodded. Someone removed her voice from the score. Now someone's trying to remove her from memory. A knock at the station door interrupted them. P.C. Willoughby re-entered. "Another envelope, sir." Pinned to the church fence this time, Purbright opened it. Inside was a clipping from a 6-month-old parish circular, announcing the appointment of a new assistant organist. Underneath it, typed in the same jagged style, "Ask who benefits from silence. Ask who feared being drowned out." Purbright looked up slowly. "Love," he said, "we need to speak to Miss Priddy again. And then we'll have a word with the organist." Miss Priddy received them in her sitting room with the clipped cordiality of a woman used to company she neither enjoyed nor refused. Her flat overlooked the canal, and the decor was a chorus of beige and blush, as though her upholstery had once been bold but had spent too many seasons in polite retreat. The scent of lavender hung faintly in the air, though it failed to mask the trace of varnish and something metallic, possibly polish, possibly something older. "I gather this is about Mildred," she said, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm afraid I've no news." Purbright offered a kind smile. "It's not her whereabouts we're asking about, Miss Priddy. It's her warnings." She stiffened. "Warnings? You were close," he said. "You sang together for nearly 15 years. You often sat side by side, shared tea after evensong. We know she expressed concern over changes in the choir's music, insertions, reversals, hidden alterations." Miss Priddy gave a little shake of the head, somewhere between denial and fatigue. It was choir room mutterings. She didn't trust Mr. Felton, said he had itchy fingers when it came to tradition, thought he was tailoring the liturgy to suit his ambitions. "Ambitions?" asked Love. "He's quite young, eager to be seen as a modernizer, and he doesn't like being contradicted, especially not by someone with as much experience as Mildred. She embarrassed him more than once, publicly." "Did she confront him about the altered scores?" Purbright asked. "Oh yes," Miss Priddy replied. "In rehearsal, in committee, even in writing. But the others, Mr. Hackett, Mrs. Ellaby, they said she was nitpicking. So Felton took liberties, smoothed things, silenced what she didn't want. Silenced love shifted." "That's a strong phrase, Miss Priddy." She looked away. "Is it?" Purbright studied her. "Miss Priddy, we've seen the photo placed in your choir robe pocket. We know someone is sending a message. The inked line across the wall she saw before I did wasn't Mildred's hand. It was yours, wasn't it? Her lips pressed together. I was trying to honor her, she said at last. After she disappeared, I kept thinking, maybe she was right about everything, and we all just let her be undone. By the organist? Love asked gently. I don't know, but he humiliated her, disregarded her edits, lied about what had been approved by the committee. He always did it with charm. He's very good at that. But Mildred never forgot the details. She'd memorized every measure of that vigil. When he changed the ending and blamed it on a misprint, she knew. You believe Felton removed her arrangement? Purbright asked. I believe he erased her. And when she threatened to go public, she mentioned speaking with the bishop. Suddenly she was gone. Purbright said nothing. He rose, walked once around the room, and paused at a side table where a metronome sat, still ticking faintly. Odd, he said, to see this running unattended. Miss Priddy's voice was quiet. It started up on its own, just after the service. I hadn't touched it. Purbright adjusted the tempo dial. Someone wanted you to remember the rhythm. Perhaps the missing beat back at the station, they reviewed the latest message again. Ask who benefits from silence. Ask who feared being drowned out. It wasn't just poetic, it was pointed, and it fit precisely into a pattern. The final score altered, the vigil rearranged, the choir realigned, and the most persistent voice removed. By early evening, they paid a visit to Marcus Felton. He lived above the music shop in a flat dominated by keyboards, stands, and piles of sheet music like small drifts of snow across the floorboards. A faint organ recording played from a speaker in the corner. Bach, but paced unusually slow. Inspector, Felton said, greeting them with a smile a fraction too bright. And Sergeant. I presume this isn't a courtesy call. Purbright accepted the invitation inside without returning the smile. It's about Miss Instow. Felton's expression flickered. Still no word? Only plenty of whispers, Love replied. Enough to reach the vicarage and the vestry, and most of Market Street. Felton's laugh was forced. Well, that's Flaxborough. A secret doesn't make it past the teacups. No, said Purbright, but sometimes the truth gets caught in the sugar. He walked to a music stand and examined the sheet there. It was the Easter Vigil, the original version, no annotations. Funny thing, he said, this copy's immaculate, not a pencil mark, not a crease. But the choir folder had corrections. Bar 67, the soprano close. Miss Instow had revised it. Felton tilted his head. She may have proposed revisions, Inspector, but the committee voted to retain the traditional close. I restored it. Love stepped forward. And the key she reported missing? The changes that kept reappearing? The solo line that vanished from the Good Friday chorus? Felton's voice cooled. If you're suggesting I sabotaged her contributions, I suggest you provide evidence. Purbright walked to the piano bench, where a folder lay half-tucked beneath a cushion. He retrieved it. Inside were several sheets, marked with corrections in blue. Miss Instow's handwriting. Odd place for archival material, he said. Felton bristled. She gave them to me for safekeeping. Then why were they never returned to the choir cupboard? I hadn't got round to it. Love opened his notebook. We've also listened to a rehearsal tape where she objected to your alterations, and then she left the room. She wasn't seen after that day. Felton stood very still. You're not accusing me, Purbright met his gaze. Not yet. From his coat pocket, he drew the final envelope found on the church fence. But someone is. He handed it over. Felton opened it, read the typed message, and blanched. The final cadence was hers. You erased it. Now she's the only one. We hear Sergeant Love leaned forward in his seat as they drove back toward the station, his fingers drumming a gentle rhythm on the clipboard resting across his knees. Do you think he wrote it? He asked. Purbright, who was watching the slow drift of the hedgerows beyond the window, replied mildly. The letter? Possibly, but I'm more interested in how quickly he recognized the reference to the cadence. That wasn't general knowledge. Love nodded slowly. He did go a bit pale. Indeed, guilt is often less colorful than fear, but more telling when it stains the face. They passed the vicarage just as the last of the daylight withdrew behind the chapel spire. The lamplight flickered faintly inside the vestibule. In Flaxborough, even illumination seemed reluctant to interfere with the more delicate business of secrets. Inside the station, Constable Harrop had left a note on Purbright's desk. Mrs. Ardley phoned. Said there's something she found in her hymn book. Insists it's not hers. Wants someone to look at it immediately. Purbright exhaled softly. Come on, love. Let's see what's hiding among the psalms now. Mrs. Ardley greeted them with a worried flutter of hands and the same beaded cardigan she wore to every town meeting. Her house smelled of boiled cabbage and anxiety. She ushered them into the sitting room and pointed to a slim blue volume resting on the edge of her upright piano. I only opened it this morning, she said, and it fell right out. It wasn't there Sunday. I always keep my book in the basket near the umbrella stand. No one touches it. Love stepped forward and picked up the object. It was a folded slip of thick paper, cream, with a faint watermark. On the inside was typed. They rearranged the notes until the silence hummed with lies. She heard it. So did I. Beneath it, in blue ink, a hand-drawn treble clef curled neatly like a question mark. Purbright examined the ink, bluer than standard biro, finer than most fountain pens. Do you recognize this? He asked Mrs. Ardley. She shook her head. No. But the writing. It's like the little marks Mildred used to make when she lent you music. Her initials were always like that clef. She fancied herself a composer. Love looked up. So whoever wrote this is mimicking her. Or quoting her, Purbright murmured. He turned back to Mrs. Ardley. Have you had any visitors? Anyone who might have placed this in your hymn book? She hesitated. Well, my niece came by Tuesday, stayed half an hour, but she's never interested in church matters. And young. She'd never... Who else has access to the vestibule lockers? Oh, well, most of the committee. And the choir, of course. But that book never leaves my hall. I keep it next to the firewood. No one would think to look there. Purbright nodded and pocketed the slip. Thank you, Mrs. Ardley. We may need to take the book with us, if you don't mind. She nodded, already looking nervously toward the kettle. Back at the station, they laid out the growing puzzle on the evidence board. The typed letters, all anonymous, pointed, and oddly poetic. The scuffed heel print under the organ bench. The missing edits to the vigil. The accusations against Felton. And now this echo of Mildred's own markings appearing in a parishioner's hymn book. What's the link? Love asked aloud. Felton rewrote her arrangement. Priddy says the committee turned on her. Now these notes, literally, are cropping up all over town. Either she's making a comeback from hiding, or someone's decided to play her ghost. Purbright adjusted the corner of the new note on the board. The second, I think. But not for mischief. These aren't threats. They're laments. She heard it. So did I, Love repeated. So, who's the I? Priddy again. No, said Purbright. Priddy's pen was heavier. This is a cleaner hand. Someone who wants to be precise. Possibly Felton. A bit dramatic for him. True, but not impossible. Just then, Harrop appeared in the doorway with a folder. This came from the bishop's secretary. You'd asked for records of committee decisions from the past year. Purbright opened it. Inside was a memo, dated 4 months prior. A vote had been taken to remove certain unverified annotations from the choral archive. The motion was tabled by none other than Felton and seconded by Mr. Hackett, who had, until now, appeared to be a benign figure with a fondness for sponge cake and organ benches. Was Mildred at this meeting? Love asked. No, said Purbright. She'd been away that week, visiting a cousin in Tethering. Her arrangement was struck down in absentia. Love frowned. Wouldn't she have fought that? She did. The following week, she requested the committee rescind the motion. They declined. She submitted a formal complaint. And then, Purbright turned the final page. A letter from the bishop's office confirmed receipt of her complaint, but noted that the matter was deemed internal and best resolved through harmony among musicians. Love groaned. That's some irony. Purbright looked thoughtful. So we have motive, opportunity, and method. But what we don't have is her, or a body, or confirmation that she placed any of these notes herself. Just then, the phone rang. Harrop answered and called out, It's the vicar. Says someone's broken into the vestry cupboard. The Easter robes have been moved. And there's something odd pinned to the bulletin board. Purbright rose. Let's go. The dead don't return, but their silence can still change the tune. Flaxborough's churchyard had always worn a sensible stillness by twilight, a kind of moral hush befitting its modest congregation. But the light flickering behind the vestry windows now suggested something more febrile, an intrusion of the improper into the sacrosanct. As Purbright and Love approached the door, the vicar greeted them with an expression usually reserved for funeral mix-ups and errant altar wine deliveries. It was Mrs. Blempton who noticed it, he said. Came early to adjust the palm fronds for next Sunday. Said the cupboard door was ajar and the latch dangling like a tooth. Inside, the cupboard told its tale plainly enough. Choir robes hung skewed, several pushed to one side as if rifled through in haste. On the bulletin board nearby, pinned with a bent paperclip, was a typed card. Not an anonymous note this time, but something stranger. March 19th. They met to erase. April 3rd. They sang without her. May 7th. They forgot the coda. June 12th. They remembered too late. It was a list of dates, each with its own cryptic charge, beneath which someone had scrawled in pen. Not the last. Love reading it twice. Is this a threat or a timeline? Purbright's eyes lingered on the dates. It's a liturgical calendar, he said softly. Those Sundays correspond to each of the vigil rehearsals. Mildred missed the March meeting. The rest follow significant services. Whoever wrote this is marking moments of silence. The vicar coughed lightly. Nothing else seems to be missing, though Mrs. Blempton swears one of the sashes has been replaced with a fake. She's very sensitive to hemwork, you know. They thanked him and stepped out. The air was thick with summer's retreat. Purbright paused at the path leading around the church. There's a pattern here, love. Not just with the notes, but with the intrusion. Someone's staging a progression. A progression toward what? Purbright didn't reply immediately. He seemed to consider the suggestion not with alarm, but with a kind of intellectual restraint, as if mentally moving pieces on a chessboard. Resentment seeks echo. This isn't destruction. It's recital. A wrong played back. They walked in silence toward the car, until Love asked, "Do you believe she's dead?" "I believe she was silenced," said Purbright. "Whether by committee or by choice remains unclear." As they turned onto High Street, the lamps cast long shadows across the cobbles. The news had already begun its migration. At number 12, Mrs. Sproat stood watering her begonias with theatrical obliviousness. "Saw the lights on again, did you?" she called, without prompting. "Poor Reverend must be losing sleep. That cupboard was always tricky, mind you. Ask Mr. Felton Love muttered. "Not 5 minutes and it's gossip." Purbright's brow ticked upward. "It's faster than telegrams. More prone to embellishment, but often just as informative." Back at the station, they returned to the evidence board. Love taped up the new card beneath the hymn book note. The timeline it suggested now spanned 4 months and intersected with every moment of Mildred's professional decline. Harrop entered with a small envelope. "Found this behind the radiator near the rehearsal pews," he said. "Likely dropped. It's addressed to Mrs. Priddy." The envelope bore no postmark. Inside was a single sheet, typed, "You voted to silence her. Now silence will answer." Love blinked. "That's not poetic. That's direct." Purbright held the sheet up to the light. Same typeface, same spacing, no signature. So far the pattern holds. No threats of violence, no specific demands, just judgment. They called Mrs. Priddy to the station under the guise of further clarification. She arrived with her usual blend of self-importance and what Love had begun to describe as veneer humility. "Another letter?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "Do they mean to shame me now, as they shamed her then?" Purbright offered her tea. "Do you believe she was shamed?" Priddy snorted gently. "Of course. Not publicly. Never that. We simply corrected her. Mildred always took disagreement personally. But then she believed herself a genius. And the vote. She was furious, called it sabotage, said we were jealous. But it wasn't like that. It was about preserving standards." Love asked, "Did you see her after that meeting?" "No," said Priddy. "She stopped attending altogether. Some said she was ill. I assumed she'd finally realized she'd outstayed her welcome. Did she ever threaten anyone?" Priddy gave a thin smile. "Not Mildred. She didn't have it in her. But she had a talent for making others feel like villains. That was her weapon. They let her go. Love sat back. That's the third person who claims they corrected her, but none seem to think they caused harm." "They rarely do," said Purbright. "Sanction is often disguised as benevolence, especially in choirs." Just as they were packing up, the station phone rang again. Harrop answered, then turned pale. "A man's just collapsed at the bakery." "It's Mr. Felton Love was already reaching for his jacket." "Another stroke?" Harrop shook his head. "No. They say he was reading something when it happened. A letter." They rushed to the bakery. Felton was sitting upright on a stool, breathing but shaken, a cup of water trembling in his hand. On the counter beside him lay a folded sheet, more of that same fine cream paper. Purbright picked it up and read silently. "What you rewrote was not yours to sign. What you removed was not yours to deny. Your coda will come soon enough. He folded the sheet carefully and slipped it into his coat. Felton looked up, his voice a hoarse whisper. They mean to ruin me. Purbright looked past him, toward the church spire, visible through the bakery's narrow window. Or, he said, they mean to remind you. Back at the station, the atmosphere had shifted from one of patient sifting to something closer to anticipatory wait. Harrop hovered like a schoolboy who'd heard a forbidden whisper but lacked the courage to repeat it. Purbright, notebook open, sat with fingers templed beneath his chin. Love, still clutching the Felton letter in its evidence sleeve, paced slowly behind him. It's odd, Love muttered. They don't accuse anyone of murder. It's not revenge, not really. Just reprimands, declarations, but the intent's getting darker. It's a campaign, Purbright replied quietly. Each missive is more pointed than the last. It started with absence, then guilt, then shame, and now fear love stopped at the board. But all from someone gone. Or presumed to be. Purbright rose and walked to the pinned-up timeline. That may be the true intention, a voice returned. The guilt, whether earned or imagined, is making them see ghosts. Harrop cleared his throat. Sir. Mrs. Dooley's just phoned. Said her dog dug up something behind the choir practice hut. Love raised a brow. Something or someone. Hard to say. She screamed and ran inside, said it looked like cloth and a finger. By the time they arrived at the rear of the old parish hut, the scene was already surrounded by a modest clutch of villagers pretending they had urgent business along that exact path. Mrs. Dooley stood quivering in her apron, eyes wide and arms crossed. The dog, an energetic mongrel named Larch, sat wagging proudly beside his crater. Inside the disturbed soil, barely hidden beneath a layer of old compost, was indeed a sliver of decaying floral fabric, lace-trimmed. Protruding from it, unmistakably, was the curled tip of a human finger. A ring still clung to it, silver, inset with an oval of jet. Love exhaled. It's her, isn't it? Purbright said nothing at first. He knelt, his face level with the soil, examining the fabric's pattern and the buried fold where the ring gleamed. Then he stood, expression unreadable. We won't confirm that until forensics arrive. But I think we both know the answer. Harrop stepped forward. Sir, if that's Mildred Finch, then these letters were being written by someone who knew she was dead, Purbright finished. Or someone who wants us to believe they were sent posthumously. Back at the station, Sergeant Love sat before the evidence board again, this time staring more soberly at the dates. Let's suppose it was her, he said. That means the letters are from her killer. But why warn them instead of running? Purbright replied, still pacing slowly. It's not about escape. It's about the message. This killer doesn't want to be unseen. They want to be felt, heard, but why delay the body's discovery until now? Because finding the body is the final movement in the composition, the crescendo. This has been a performance in 4 parts. The rehearsal's now over. Love leaned in, eyes narrowing. Sir, we need to go back to the beginning. If the vote was the inciting incident, then the minutes from that meeting are crucial. Mrs. Priddy said they were taken by Felton, but he said they were reviewed. Reviewed by whom? Purbright's eyes snapped to him. Precisely. They returned to the church, quiet now under the noon light. The vicar, visibly rattled by the morning's discovery, led them to the locked cabinet in his office. "We keep all committee minutes here," he said. "At least those are not misplaced." Inside was the usual clutter: choir budget sheets, baptismal schedules, weathered folders marked "Choir Retreat," and a file stamped "March Committee, Confidential." Love opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper with several names typed neatly, then crossed through in pencil: Finch, Priddy, Felton, Blempton, Harridge. Below them, one name remained uncrossed, underlined twice: Rowena Skegg. Love frowned. She left the village a month ago. Said she'd found a post in Norwich. Purbright's voice was low. She was the secretary during that meeting. Her departure was sudden, too quiet. They drove to her last known address on Featherbank Road, a modest semi-detached cottage with an overgrown path. The letterbox was crammed with unopened circulars. Through the front window, dust lay undisturbed. But behind the house, at the kitchen door, a faint smell curled in the summer air. Inside, nothing had been packed. The kettle was still on its base, the calendar still on June. A journal sat open on the table, entries in careful script. Purbright scanned a page. They refused to see it. Said she was too proud, too temperamental. They didn't care what it did to her. I wrote everything down. I won't let them forget. He turned the page. The next entry was dated June 10th, 4 days before her supposed departure. The costume was buried. So were the rest of my doubts. They will hear her, through me, if need be. Love's mouth was dry. She was close to Finch? Purbright nodded slowly. Perhaps more than that. Perhaps she saw in her a reflection. And when Mildred broke, Rowena composed the response. Harrop entered behind them, holding his phone. "Sir, forensics confirm it's Finch. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Likely struck from behind." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Purbright said, "We need to find Rowena Skegg. Not just for what she did, but for what she still intends to do." Rain came thin and persistent that afternoon, the kind that seemed more like regret than weather, painting the Flaxborough pavements a deeper grey and casting leaden reflections in the puddles outside Rowena Skegg's cottage. Inside the unlit rooms, the officers moved with gloved hands and careful steps, cataloguing the scene. Sergeant Love stood by the bookshelf, running his finger lightly along the spines of hymnals and educational texts, improving vocal range in women's chorales, harmonic devotion, reflections on choral leadership. "It's all about voice," he murmured. Purbright, kneeling by the journal again, traced a penciled sentence at the edge of the page, half erased, as if she'd thought better of it mid-thought. "They killed her spirit before they ever touched her body." He closed the book gently and looked up. She's a woman who needed to be heard. And when that failed, she needed others to be reminded. They found no sign of Rowena herself. No packed suitcase, no withdrawal from the bank, no sightings reported in Norwich or anywhere beyond. The departure, it became increasingly clear, had never happened. Rowena Skegg had not left the village. She had simply vanished, more artfully than Mildred Finch, but no less completely. At the station, a quiet unease had settled among the staff. The letters had stopped. No new missives since the discovery of Finch's remains. Love tried to take comfort in the possibility that the campaign was over, that the final act had played out. But Purbright, ever immune to reassurance, remained cautious. "She's orchestrated this too deliberately to disappear into silence." "There's more to come." Love turned from the window. "Sir, If she's still in Flaxborough, she's either being sheltered or hiding in plain sight. Purbright's expression shifted. Or both. That evening, a breakthrough came from a most improbable corner. Mrs. Teatime's second-hand bookshop, where a young assistant named Lydia had been sorting recent donations. In a box marked Estate of R.S. were several slim volumes of poetry, a handwritten devotional, and, tucked between the pages of a copy of Songs for Sorrow, a letter addressed to M.F. in Rowena's meticulous script. The letter was undated, but clearly recent. It was, in tone, half eulogy, half confession. "Mildred, you once told me silence was a kindness. That to let fools talk themselves out was nobler than confronting them. But silence is cowardice when you know better. You let them wear you down. But I was not built for erosion. I am the echo now, the hymn they buried. They will answer." Purbright read it aloud at the station, his voice low and unhurried, as though the meaning would unfold more truly if treated with patience. When he finished, no one spoke. Love cleared his throat. "That's not just farewell. It's foreshadowing." That night, under the persistent drizzle, Love and Purbright returned to the church. They moved through the nave with torches dimmed, the air cold with more than weather, past the vestry and up the narrow stairs to the choir loft. The empty bench remained, Mildred's place, but something had been left upon it, a folded black folder. Inside, sheet music, handwritten, a cantata of sorts, titled Requiem for the Silenced. 4 movements, each is named for a virtue turned sour. Devotion, betrayed. Justice, deferred. Harmony, shattered. Remembrance, demanded. Love exhaled. "She's still here, sir. She's still speaking." Purbright nodded slowly. "And this is her program, which means she's not done performing." In the margin of the final page, in faint pencil, a time was scrawled, "Evensong, Thursday." That was tomorrow. "She's going to make a scene," Love muttered, during the service. Purbright's voice was quiet but firm. "Not a scene, Sergeant. A finale." Thursday arrived beneath a troubled sky, as if the heavens themselves hesitated at what was to come. Flaxborough, wrapped in a hush, seemed to sense the day's import. Though no formal announcement had been made, word had spread in the way it always did, through the slow, reliable web of glances, whispers, and hedged remarks in butchers' queues and post office lobbies. The choir was to sing Evensong again, and the villagers, conscious of the dark news of recent weeks, came in muted procession, eyes turned inward, hearts suspended. Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love sat not in the usual rear pew reserved for ecclesiastical outsiders, but unobtrusively to the side, close to the transept. Their posture was still, though their minds were not. Purbright watched the altar with the unblinking calm of a man who understood that all true drama begins in silence. At precisely 6 o'clock, the organ's first tentative chords rose, dry and mechanical, like breath returning to a body not quite sure it wanted it. Mrs. Hampole, who had agreed, nervously and with much crossing of herself to lead the choir, stood stiffly at the front, baton trembling in her hand. The girls sang without conviction, eyes glancing toward Mildred Finch's empty place as if the bench itself might lift and speak. And then it happened. During the third hymn, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, the organ struck a chord not in the score, a note too sharp, too insistent. It was followed by a subtle shift in tempo, and then, unmistakably, a melodic phrase not written by Parry or Tallis, but by Rowena Skegg, the melody of the final movement from her Requiem for the Silenced. A hush fell. Mrs. Hampole turned, stunned. The choir faltered. The organ, left untouched, continued, its keys pressing down mechanically, each note deliberate. The congregation froze. "Good Lord," whispered Love. "It's playing itself." Purbright stood slowly, moving to the side aisle and slipping around the base of the pulpit. Beneath the loft, behind the wooden screen, he found the electric organ's modest circuitry, still humming. But no one sat at the bench. He motioned to Love. "Check the loft." Now the sergeant bounded up the narrow stairway, each creak echoing with dread. Moments later, he called down. "No one, sir. Just a speaker." Wired in back below, Purbright examined the small amplifier. A cassette player had been spliced in, its timer rigged with what appeared to be parts from a kitchen cooker, alarm, trigger, and playback head. "She's orchestrated a posthumous performance," Purbright murmured. "An automatic epilogue." The music swelled now, the melody weaving an elegy that no parish council would dare include in its hymn book. Those who knew Rowena's writing recognized the cadence, the pain that had threaded through her letters. Every note seemed to accuse. Every pause was a memory held too long. At the end of the piece, silence returned. Not polite silence, but something denser, thick with unresolved questions. The congregation left slowly, as though released from something larger than ceremony. Love rejoined the inspector at the foot of the nave. "You think she's dead, sir?" Purbright didn't answer immediately. His eyes had fixed on the pulpit above, where a slip of folded paper had been tucked behind the brass frame of the lectionary. He retrieved it with care. It was written in the same hand as the earlier letters, but in ink this time. A final missive. "I will not be found. That is my choice. I leave them with the sound of what they did. That is my justice. Let them try to harmonize now. No signature. Just the embossed watermark of the parish stationery. Irony in paper form." Back at the station, with the file open before them and a dozen unanswered questions hanging over the desks, Love sighed. "She's either gone for good or still watching. Either way, we'll never pin her." Purbright nodded slowly. "Some crimes are solved not with arrests, but with consequences. This town will sing differently now. And that, I suspect, was her real verdict, a silence settled between them. Outside, the bells of St. Botolph's rang the hour. Their tones were unchanged, yet the echo seemed altered, slightly off, like a choir adjusting to a voice it no longer had.